Okay. Hi everyone, Johan Rockström here. Sorry for the delay in starting this first Hangout in our Planetary Boundary MOOC. It's wonderful to have so many of you joining. I think we're up to 95 participants. I just came from another Hangout with a whole group of philanthropists and business leaders in a meeting that was called Capitalism Within Planetary Boundaries, which was a dialogue filled with risk analysis, but also an analysis of enormous opportunities in a transition to business models within a safe operating space. And tomorrow I have another hangout with none less than Sir Richard Branson, who is also very excited about the idea of transforming business models within planetary boundaries. So there's no doubt in my mind that the science, the insights, the thinking around Earth resilience, global sustainability, Anthropocene within a safe operating space at planetary boundaries is really a topical and central issue in the entire agenda of global sustainability today. We have a whole list of very exciting questions, so let's see how far we can come. I'll be doing in the following way. You're posting questions, which is great, and they're being voted up, and I'll be trying to take them one by one, based in fact on some of your desire expressed in the voting. And I'd like to start with the question that comes from Günther Wienberg and Pontus Hummelman, which is a very basic question on what Earth processes do scientists believe contribute to the more stabilized Holocene period. So as you know, as you've seen in the first set of modules, over the past, in fact, millions of years throughout the Pleistocene, we see a very almost predictable pattern of glacial periods with intermittent interglacial periods with a cycle of in the order of 120,000 to 200,000 years. These have been explained quite precisely by a scientist called Milankovic. They even call them Milankovic cycles, which determine whether the planet is in or out an interglacial through the Earth's position vis-a-vis the Sun, and also its tilt, but also its position vis-a-vis other planets in the solar system. So scientists are quite clear that the big swings without anthropogenic, without human interference, are determined by large forces which are related to our position vis-a-vis the Sun and our neighboring planets. So that is why we are within an interglacial right now, the interglacial that we've been in for the past 10,000 years, which we call the Holocene. Now, what is even more interesting is the question, well, so what is it that has made the Holocene so extraordinarily stable? Because we had an interglacial 120,000 years back called the Eemian, for example, and that interglacial had a period over many thousands of years, but was actually in fact not as stable as the Holocene. The Holocene, as you know, is an extraordinary period because it has a maximum variability of temperature, for example, of ±1 degree Celsius, which is extraordinary also compared with previous interglacials. And I think it's fair to say that scientists do not know the exact explanation why the Holocene is so stable. There are a few hypotheses, though. One being that if you look at the entire Earth system evolution over the past 1 million years, one could see potentially a trend towards a slowing down of the variability, the natural variability of the Earth system. That could be one factor. The second factor could be the way the self-regulating interactions in the geobiospheric processes of the Earth system operate. So what we've learned and what has been emphasized in the modules, for example, is that up until now, since the Industrial Revolution in the mid-18th century, we see the Earth system applying in an incredibly, let's say, biophysically determinate way, a set of negative feedbacks in order to dampen disturbance. So what we're seeing is the Earth system applying its biosphere, its atmosphere, its hydrosphere, all its oceanographic, its albedo, its stratospheric processes dampen and reduce variability. So that's quite interesting how we see, for example, 50% of the emission of carbon dioxide from industrial emissions being taken up by the biosphere as, in fact, a process which contributes to persist in this incredibly stable Holocene state. So resilience may have something to do with it. What is also important to emphasize, finally, is that as far as we know, we are 10,000 years into the Holocene, but if we do not push ourselves outside of the Holocene equilibrium, the state, the stable state that the planet is in right now, we have at least another 10,000 years in this Eden's garden, or this incredibly conducive biophysical state. So that is what is at stake, our challenge of applying all our wisdom to develop world economic development without pushing ourselves outside of this equilibrium. So that's the kind of starting point, and that takes us very quickly to the question about, well, so we've been lecturing. Professor Gary Peterson has been talking about the good Anthropocene, about the possibility of staying within the Anthropocene, and then the question is, well, but isn't this a bit confusing that on the one hand I've been talking very, emphasizing very throughout my lectures the importance of the Holocene, and at the same time the question is, can we navigate a good Anthropocene? And the explanation is quite simple, that clearly the Anthropocene as a definition is the following, that humanity has become a global driving force of change at the planetary scale. We have overtaken the natural forces that have been regulating the pathway of the Earth system in and out of interglacials and glacial periods historically, and now we humans are these forces, a larger force of change. We're not necessarily larger in terms of sudden shocks, but we're larger in terms of the long-term amplitude. So we've never seen the pace of change we're seeing today. So the Anthropocene is not another equilibrium. It is a geological epoch defined by what are the driving forces that influence the state of the Earth system. So navigating a good Anthropocene is by being this global force in a way that enables us to remain in what I've called Holocene-like conditions. So the Anthropocene is not another state. There's a risk, if we think of a bad Anthropocene, that we in fact push the planet outside of the equilibrium. That would mean, for example, that we push the Earth system irreversibly towards a hot state where we have at least 70 meters of increased sea level rise. We don't have any ice sheets left on Earth. We essentially cannot produce food in the mid-equator latitudes anywhere on the planet, and the only place where humanity could at all survive would be in the high latitudes, where it still would be at least 10 plus degrees Celsius warmer than today. That would be another state. That would be the bad Anthropocene. But in a good Anthropocene, we would aim at remaining in our current equilibrium, the equilibrium which is our interglacial over the past 10,000 years, but becoming good stewards of that future. So in that sense, there's no contradiction. But what this shows is, though, that the Holocene, being a stable biophysical state of the planet, is different from how we define the Anthropocene, because the Anthropocene is still an era where a new driving force have come to play, namely humanity. But it's not another stability domain of the planet. And I hope that that explains how these two concepts can actually live in harmony together. That's on the first question. Then I'd like to raise a question of, let's see here. Well, let's take the list of. I'm having a bit of difficulty seeing what questions are. All right, I'll take the top. Well, there's a very high voted question on urban planning mechanisms. Which urban planning mechanisms that are crucial for sustainable development in Anthropocene. I just want to remind you that there is a module, a 7th module, where we'll be probing particularly the urban resilience, the urban sustainability challenge, led by Professor Thomas Elmquist. So it's sort of say in the pipeline. But let me just say a few words. I mean, one is in a way to set the stage for the importance of that module. That we're living in a world which we know has tipped towards having a majority of the world population living in urban areas. 2/3 of the cities in the world are not even built, which we need, the cities we need in 2030. And we can envisage a world where potentially up to 70% of the world population resides in cities. Now, this is, in fact, a potential for us, because having concentrated populations living in cities could actually be a vehicle to secure the sustainability of the adjacent biosphere that we depend on for carbon sinks, biodiversity, food security, etc. Now, how to plan cities to make them both resilient, good livable cities, and sustainable is something that is an enormous challenge. But we know, in fact, in the fundamental elements, what is required. And what is exciting, and what will come up in the 7th module, is in particular the importance and the enormously beneficial role of being sustainable stewards of urban ecosystems and biodiversity in urban settings as a means of building resilient urban environments. But again, I'll simply have this as a little teaser for the 7th module. Yeah. So let's move on then to a question. If we go up and check the voting scores here, I think it's. I'll take one in the meantime, which is a question that has come up from Romulo Tagallo, who's interested in the question of what global bodies or institutions do you think we need to grow in the Anthropocene? So again, we have a module coming up on global governance, which will be featuring Victor Gallas, who has recently come out with a book on innovation and governance. And in fact, we've just mapped out the state of the art in science on what are the most exciting ideas of how to govern human development in the Anthropocene. And I'd advise you to have a check of that new report that just came out last week. It's a Stockholm Resilience Center Global Challenges Foundation joint report on global governance. And I think we should post that out so we can share that with all participants. But I'll give you a few snapshots of some of the thinking here. I mean, one is that I think it's increasingly clear that in the Anthropocene, where we're transgressing planetary boundaries, where we're seeing the risk of major abrupt tipping points, where we're even seeing the risk of humanity disrupting the entire Earth system, we need strengthened global governance. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that to support innovation and positive trajectories for communities, businesses, regions, nations at the local to regional scale, we need a support by regulatory measures and big policy decisions at the global scale. So something that has always excited me a lot is when the late Nobel laureate, Professor Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize based on her empirical work showing that polycentric governance and community engagement, even around the global commons and local commons, can be very, very successful through innovation bottom up. But also she recognizes that in the Anthropocene, that has to be connected to the ability for us to define criteria for global sustainability at the planetary scale. So basically, to put it simple, what I think is that the world should consider today, when we understand that we're in the Anthropocene, we understand the risk of global tipping points, we understand that the Holocene is our desired planetary state, we therefore understand that sustainable development must now be redefined as being human development within a safe operating space of planetary boundaries. When we recognize that, the consequence of that is that we need to define science-based global sustainability criteria at the planetary scale, agreed upon by all citizens or nations in the world, within which we can then have implementation across scales. So you can have For example, if the world agrees on a planetary boundary on climate, which, as you know, the planetary boundary science indicates should be 1.5 degrees Celsius of maximum warming after the pre-industrial, uh, in comparison to the pre-industrial average global temperature. But there is already a boundary on the table, which is the politically agreed 2 degrees Celsius target. That, to me, is a climate planetary boundary. It translates to a global carbon budget, which is an absolute amount of carbon. As you know, the fifth assessment of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has written in that that budget could amount to allowing us to emit another 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide, which would give us something like 66% chance of staying within 2 degrees, which I think is a very optimistic analysis. But let's for a moment assume that that is okay. So that is our budget. That's our absolute budget. So you apply a planetary scale boundary. It translates to a budget, and that budget must then politically be agreed upon of how to share in a fair way among all citizens on Earth. And we have the methods for that. We have a number of methods that take into consideration, as I'm sure you're well aware, both historic responsibility, economic capability, development levels, human development index factors, and that then translates to a distribution of this budget, which, for example, shows, whatever method you pick, that the old OECD countries, the rich Annex 1 countries within the United Nations Framework Convention, would essentially need to be decarbonized by 2030, 2035 to allow for developing nations to have a slightly slower transition into a decarbonized economy. So this is an example of how a planetary boundary thinking at the planetary scale is not in contradiction with applied policy at the national scale. And what I find tremendously exciting is that what we're seeing so much evidence is that once that planetary scale definition trickles down to the national scale and is implemented as strong policy measures, for example, when German Chancellor Angela Merkel last Monday says, we are staying on course, defining our responsibility of a planetary boundary for climate as a 40% reduction of emissions by 2020 compared to 1990, which becomes a number. It's a reduction of 22 million tons of carbon dioxide for the world's fourth largest economy, Germany. That becomes a hard policy measure, which gives a very clear playing field for business. And then energy utilities, Mercedes-Benz and other companies simply know what is, the playing field, the safe operating space for Germany, and they can then apply, their investments accordingly. And that is, I think, the way we should think about this, to connect the planetary scale with the local scale. How do we do that within the current governance system? Well, I think the only thing we have to play with is the United Nations. So I think it is, in fact, and that's is underlying the question. We need to, strengthen the United Nations' ability to take, for example, majority decisions. We cannot operate the climate system as we do today with consensus-based decisions. You must simply do as the Security Council and allow majority voting, for example. So, there are a couple of very concrete measures we can take. Finally, to close, I must say that, despite a lot of critique that is coming up and a lot of nervousness, I'm among those who are actually very enthusiastic and even quite optimistic when it comes to how the open working group of the General Assembly of the United Nations has designed the draft framework for the Sustainable Development Goals to be replacing the Millennium Development Goals. Because even though it's messy with 17 goals, they do include 4 planetary boundaries on climate, freshwater, biodiversity, and oceans. And they have built into the goals even the boundaries on land, nitrogen, phosphorus, and chemicals through the food security goal, which states that we're going to eradicate hunger through sustainable agriculture. So, that is an example of how the world is starting gradually to understand that in the globalized phase of environmental risks in the Anthropocene, we need to think, as Yin Yong Kim of the World Bank, as Angel Gurria of the OECD, as Ban Ki-moon of the UN clearly states today, global sustainability is a prerequisite to alleviate poverty and hunger. That's the new agenda. It's a completely new narrative. It means, as we've talked in this course, of abandoning this naive idea of growth without limits, but it also means shedding off the old environmental idea of limits to growth to instead embark on a new strategy of growth within limits. So I think, we need to push that also at the governance scale. Okay, that was a long story on an important fundamental question. We have then a question on that goes as follows: our social economic values conflict with social ecological relations. What cultural political shifts can we hope to make in the near future? So this is a deep philosophical question, you could argue. I agree with what is implied in this question, which is that our current social economic values are coupled very strongly with the belief that economic growth is the only vehicle to human prosperity, human well-being, wealth creation. Basically, to put it very clearly, that GDP is our method to develop. Now, I'm among those who, just like Jeff Sachs, who has run a course prior to this, very respectful to the fact that economic growth has proven a very effective means of lifting people out of poverty. There's no doubt in my mind that we need economic growth to lift, the 500 million people in Africa living in absolute poverty, to enable prosperity or the first steps of development among the vast majority in this world that still live in poverty. So one cannot say that our current value on socioeconomics is completely obsolete. What we need to rethink, though, which needs to then connect to the second part of the question, is a mind shift where we reconnect our economies and societies to the biosphere. We simply need to recognize that on a finite planet where we're starting to hit the ceiling of the capacity of the planet to support economic growth, we still need growth, but we need to rethink growth so that it stays within a safe operating space. And I believe that, over the next 20 years, that will mean conventional economic growth in many parts of the world. But for a very significant part of the world, it can no longer be conventional economic growth. It has to be a full transition to green growth. And this green growth needs to have, as we've been talking about already in this course, and we'll be emphasizing more, particularly 3 fundamental transitions. And the first one is the transition clearly to a deep decarbonization. The exciting thing is that here, we fulfill to 100% the conventional economists, base assumption that when something goes wrong on the market, when something gets scarce on the market, we innovate ourselves to a substitution into a perfect alternative. And as we all know, for climate, that perfect substitution is possible. Nobody cares, in fact, we do care positively, whether our lighting, electricity, heat, or cooling comes from oil, coal, or natural gas, or whether it comes from solar, wind, biomass, wave, fuel cells, etc. So we have a perfect opportunity, if we put our signals right to the market, to have a transition into a renewable, or let's say sustainably powered world economic growth. So that's quite interesting, that there's no violation. In fact, there's no contradiction at all between decarbonization, staying within a climate boundary, and economic growth. The second grand transition is a transition to a sustainable agricultural future, or sustainable food production in the world, because as we have been talking about in the course, and we'll be coming back to the course, agriculture is the world's largest culprit with regards to transgressing planetary boundaries. And that links very closely to another question put out by Yannick Schillinger on what are the agricultural alternatives and innovations which would be most promising in order to have a transition into a safe operating space. And I'll come back to those details in a little moment. It's just to tick off the point about growth, to say that, again, we have a challenge, which is to feed 9, 10, potentially 11 billion people within a safe operating space, which I would argue is in no violation with social and economic development. We need a new green revolution, which will create a lot of economic development. But we need this new green revolution to occur in a way with zero carbon emissions, zero loss of soil productivity, zero loss of biodiversity, zero contamination and undermining of freshwater ecosystem-based services in river basins in the world. And can that be done by still growing productivity, livelihoods, incomes for rural communities? My, I think, very clear conclusion of that is yes, it is possible. And how is that possible? Well, as Yannick already kind of hints, there is a whole battery of opportunities to have win-win solutions for food production. I mean, one of the most exciting, I think, is, for example, the biotechnological science showing that we might be in a breakthrough when it comes to developing perennial cereals. So, you know, the vast bulk of food production is for wheat, corn, maize, millets, sorghum, you know, all the basic cereals that build the basis of all our food diets, but also are used for feed for livestock. And today we plow those fields very effectively each year because these are annual crops. We replant them every year. But what if we could have genes taken from perennial species put into these annual crops, which we've been domesticating for 10,000 years almost, but speed that fantastic breeding process up by transforming these annuals to perennials. What happens then is that we don't need to plow, so we don't need to use diesel, we don't need to have big tractors. Secondly, as you all know, that once a plant starts establishing itself over more than a year, the root systems are incredibly more dense, the stems of these plants become more robust, so we create much more resilient crops, and therefore they're probably more likely to withstand both disease, droughts, floods, and moreover can produce more food, and moreover are storing more carbon, building more soil productivity. So that's an example of a breakthrough with zero contradiction with growth, with enormous resilience and sustainability potential. The other one is what we've been talking about in this course, which is a transition from plowing to conservation tillage, which is copying nature by having minimum disturbance, zero plowing, maximizing rainfall infiltration by simply just opening the soil without turning the soil, which builds organic carbon, which builds water holding capacity, which makes agriculture a sink of carbon rather than a source of carbon. Again, sustainable intensification, which can help agriculture be both productive and actually contribute to growth. All this said, to close, I mean, so now I've been singing the virtue of growth. I do, and I think that is implied in the question, I'm totally convinced, not as a based on science, but as a as a citizen, that we also need deep changes in values and lifestyles. We need to recognize that we are one world community. We are a relatively big world on a small planet for the first time in human history. For the first time in human history, we risk abrupt tipping points that can lead us irreversibly into catastrophic futures where we disrupt the entire Earth system. And we're so many co-citizens, of which everyone has a right to development. So we have an ethical responsibility of sharing. And this sharing can only occur by a rich minority reducing its footprint to share with the poor majority. So I think I'm absolutely convinced that there is also an ethical dimension of rethinking our values. And these values, if they are rooted for many in religion, or if they're rooted in humanism, or if they're rooted simply in our fundamental relationship between humans and nature, which we all have, I mean, every one of us has, that is to me secondary. The key is just, I'm absolutely convinced that we all share universal values, and that universal value is that nobody on this planet wakes up in the morning deliberately wanting to undermine the planet. I think there is a deep sense of respect and willingness to live in harmony with our environment, and a recognition that the environment is actually something fundamentally important for our own well-being. So the reason why we destroy soils, why we pollute the atmosphere, why we contaminate fresh water, and why we lose biodiversity is because we're locked into this obsolete growth paradigm where it's actually been beneficial to destroy and abuse because nobody pays for that. That's a subsidy to have rapid economic incomes, which we need to rectify, and we can rectify it through policy measures. So, on the short term, creating this new value is about doing what we're doing at this MOOC, about sharing knowledge. But in parallel, we need also to have policy measures that makes it very expensive to do wrong and much cheaper to do right. And I think that's a fundamental support for that value change. So that was, and this is an enormously long discussion. We might have to have a separate hangout just on this. We have a question here. Is the name under? The name is under. Okay, so you're suggesting this the blue part? Yeah. So Kim once again. Okay, I'm not okay. Kim Locke has put a question that goes as follows. So much of the change that's needed depends on fundamental shifts in thinking, values, and belief structure, which links very closely to the previous question, to affect real changes in behavior. Mass media and education seem like the only effective tools we have. Who's leading the change in this area? This is a very good question. Well, let me start by saying that I'm a bit disappointed with mass media, to be quite frank. Mass media tends to deal with some of these environmental issues as if they were, like the Olympic Games. Every 5th year there's an IPCC report, and journalists wake up and do a big thing about it, and then there's silence in between. And I don't think we need an Olympic game type relationship to the environment. If any one of us opens the Financial Times or any morning paper in any place in the world, you'll have, the opinion pages, and then you have the news pages, and then you have the sports pages, and you have the economic pages with all the stock market prices, and then you may have some culture pages. But where are the planetary pages? Nowhere ever in any place in the world do we have, the planet featuring as centrally as economics, sports, culture, news, and opinion. And I think it would be incredibly interesting to have the equivalent of the stock market, which every day shows even a 0.10% change in any stock in the world. If you would have the planetary boundaries online in real time, showing how they change every day, so that we always are reminded of the basis for all our prosperities. There's some big issues here, which I think mass media needs to rethink. But still, I agree, of course, with the point that mass media plays an incredibly important role. That's why I'm emphasizing this. But I'm increasingly convinced that citizens in general, despite the lack of media attention to these issues, in relation to their importance, are very, very knowledgeable about the challenges we're facing and the opportunities of a transition to sustainable development. Just to give you a few numbers, we did a Gallup survey very recently, supported by something called the Global Challenges Foundation, and it shows, to our big surprise, that in countries like China, India, and Brazil, South Africa, citizens are very, very supportive of the science on climate change and expect political leadership towards sustainability. In fact, the numbers are as high as 90% of citizens answering that this is something that we feel is critically important. Even higher numbers, in fact, than my own home country, Sweden. So I think that citizen movement is actually a very important and powerful factor in leverage to change and to create confidence among political leaders that there is a mandate to act. I think the People's Climate March in New York during the climate summit in third week of September, for example, was a great manifestation. 400,000 people walking through the streets of New York. There's a funny story here that in the morning when people came out on the streets along Central Park, there were very few police officers there, and there were very few, lined up fences to cordon off and take any risks. And what emerged later was that the highest predicted number by the police force in New York was 50,000 people. That was perceived as being the absolute maximum, and 400,000 plus turned out on the streets. So that was a social manifestation of great, great power. Education plays an important role, but remember that education is a slow variable. Education takes time. It's a generational challenge. So we cannot only play the education card. We have to play many, many cards to have the rapid action we need. I mean, I don't need to remind that to you who are participating in this hangout, but you know, the next 5-10 years are absolutely decisive. This is the 5-10 year period where we need to bend the curves of global environmental change to avoid that humanity causes the Earth system to start irreversible, self-accelerating processes. That means that the Earth system would take over. So the paradox is we're in the Anthropocene, we're the major driver of change, but we might still be just the trigger point for processes that might mean that the Earth system in the Anthropocene takes over again, as it were. Okay, we have a high-scoring question that goes as follows. In your opinion, what are the most important and feasible actions from a political and economic perspective that should be taken to start bending the curves of the Great Acceleration? Are these actions in the agenda, and how do they progress? So I've mentioned the areas in an earlier question on decarbonizing the world economy and staying within the 2-degree planetary boundary, a transition to sustainable food systems within a safe operating space, and the third one, which I missed to emphasize, is business models transitioning or the economy transitioning into a circular economy. We simply need gradually to move into an economy, a logic where businesses actually operate through circular processes. Now, are these on the agenda, which I think is what the question is? Well, you know, I think everyone participating in this hangout has a responsibility to be ambassadors to defend the 2-degree limit. I mean, that is probably the most important task we have over the coming year, to safeguard that the climate negotiations do not drop 2 degrees. Because everything the climate negotiations are so complex, but everything falls out from that. On mitigation, on Annex 1, Annex 2, on financing, on technology, on the emission targets, on the pathways, everything will, in the end, emerge from that target. If we lose the 2-degree target, we are really in a blind. We will have voluntary pledges coming out, we will have different funds popping up, but we have no clue whether these add up to the global scale. So I think that is, if there's anything that needs to stay on the agenda, it's 2 degrees. The other part, which I'm and many are very excited about, is the opportunity to couple 2 degrees with a global price on carbon. And I think this is one of the agenda points which, up until recently has been portrayed as utopia. There's no chance in the world that we could agree on a global price on carbon. As you're all aware, there are very few places in the world that operate a price on carbon today. A few states in the US, Australia had one but abolished it. Sweden and the Scandinavian countries have a very high tax on carbon. The European Union has a collapsed value on carbon through the emission trading scheme. But what's emerging, which is quite interesting, is that big business leaders, and even the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, for example, is coming out in public to say that we are willing to operate within a global carbon budget, and we're also very willing to accept a global price on carbon. Or even if it's a regional price on carbon, where global business sectors abide to a price on carbon. So this might become something that comes back higher up on the agenda, in fact. And I think that's a policy measure we should keep an eye on and share. Then on what is needed to support a transition towards sustainable intensification of agriculture? Well, number one, I think, is to live up to the Aichi targets of the UN Convention for Biodiversity, which is a very ambitious set of targets of one, safeguarding in a regulatory fashion that we set off up to 17% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems and conserve them as biosphere areas that build resilience for all our agriculture and urban development. I think this is a tremendously important agenda. I think this is one way of safeguarding the remaining resilience on Earth. And therefore we have a policy agenda there. And in fact, that's something we've agreed upon. And if we can put that right into the Sustainable Development Goals agenda and let's say persist on that implementation, I think that's very good. That couples also climate and ecosystems, you know, because one of the important messages in our MOOC course is that we need to preserve the remaining rainforests on Earth as massive carbon sinks, host of biodiversity, regulators of the global hydrological cycle, a key biome for planetary boundaries. But they also couple biodiversity with climate. So I think that's quite useful. So those are a couple of examples of policy measures that are very, you know, key for a transition towards a safe operating space. Moving along then, I see time is, I would suggest that we keep on going. Yeah, another 15 minutes because we started late. So for those of you who can hang in, that would be great. So what shall we take as a next question? Okay, I think we should simply suggest. So how far is science in agreeing with the start of the Anthropocene period? Yes, this is a very good question. Posted by Richard Kimboya. Thanks for that, Richard. Now, this is quite interesting that, you know, there is a process led from the UK, from the Geological Society in the UK. So there's an Anthropocene committee working, and what is interesting with that committee, which has been working for a few years, and there's a decisive meeting next year, and there's a decision expected in 2016 on whether or not we redefine our geological epoch from the Holocene to the Anthropocene. What I find interesting in that work, where we have an interdisciplinary group of Earth system scientists and geologists, is that everyone seems to agree that we are in the Anthropocene. So that's not the issue any longer. There's so much empirical evidence of the Great Acceleration, the pressure points, that we are today, you know, superseding the natural forces of change at the planetary scale. I think that's an extraordinary advancement of science, and it's an enormous privilege for us to recognize that we are today the global actor. So the debate is, when is the starting date? And there are different arguments here, as you know. I mean, there's one group saying that, in fact, the Anthropocene started with the invention of agriculture 8,000 years back, and that is the point at which we started the journey of human regulation, inducing change in our own environment, and therefore gradually regulating the Earth system. Personally, I think this is the wrong way to argue, because I think the key here is that the Anthropocene should be the point at which we become a global force of change. And we were not a global force of change, you know, even when we came to the point of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, we were not yet a global force of change. So when coal-based industry started in the United Kingdom, the imprint in the atmosphere was minuscule. And we see that very well from the empirical curves, that it's not until the mid-1950s when the curve bends toward the hockey stick pattern that we've gone through in the earlier modules, and we see the exponential growth of pressures. So I'm among those who defend strongly that the science tells us that the starting point in the Anthropocene is, in fact, at the moment of the Great Acceleration. Now, geologists say that, well, the definition of a geological epoch must be something that is traceable for, you know, centuries, 1,000 years in the future. You should be able to read it in the strata of, you know, deep soil profiles and the geological record. You should be able to read when that starting point is. And interestingly, there is such a point, which is the first test explosions of the nuclear, what became then the Hiroshima bomb in the United States in 1945, 344, and that this might be a quite precise moment to call that the point of the start of the Anthropocene, because it will give us a strata, a readable strata for many generations to come. So there is a point that is being discussed. I think that is a reasonable way of exploring this. I'm quite sure, though, that even if the point was chosen not at 1944 but at 1955, it would still be traceable based on the fact that we had so much, let's say, anthropogenic junk as a layer in the Earth strata. But be that as it may, I think that's an academic, theoretical discussion more than a policy relevant discussion, because the key is that we have empirical evidence to say that we are a geological force of change at a planet scale. I think that's the number one issue. Okay, there's a question then by Andrea Martins that goes as follows: which should be a role played by the local government in order to prevent transgressing the planetary boundaries? And this is an incredibly good question. It's a very topical question today, because one of the, as you may be aware, one of the critiques of the planetary boundary science is that it only focused in its original analysis at the global scale, defining the guardrails or the boundaries at the Earth system scale. And the question then is, how can this be operationalized at the national scale or business scale or any relevant scale for policy? And as I hope I've been able to argue strongly, I still think that the planetary scale is useful, because in the Anthropocene we need to become planetary stewards, and therefore we also need to be able to have things adding up at the global scale. But as the question rightly points out, the action is on the ground, and the question is how this can be translated. And there are a few exciting pilot initiatives going on right now. Switzerland has, through its government, decided to try and translate the planetary boundaries into a quantified definition of Switzerland's responsibility, its share of the global budgets for climate, for biodiversity, for freshwater, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., and translate that into environmental policies for Switzerland. Sweden has done such an effort as well. So the Swedish Environmental Policy Agency has asked the Stockholm Environment Institute to calculate and develop a methodology of how to downscale the planetary boundaries to the nation scale. We've been involved in similar ways of downscaling the planetary boundaries for the Baltic Sea, to see what are the share of a load of pressure that is required to keep a system like the Baltic Sea within its desired equilibrium. Then also what we've been emphasizing is that we're based on the scientific critique that we've received since the first publication of planetary boundary work in 2009. We have over 62 scientific papers being published since then. We have over 1,000 citations related to this work. We have an enormously rich treasure to build on. And one thing that we're doing right now in the update of the science is to define regional scale boundaries for all the boundaries that have cross-scale dimensions to them. So, for example, for water, yes, a global boundary on consumptive freshwater use, but also what's the minimum amount of fresh water we need to maintain in the river basins in the world to secure the resilience of those basins, basically defined through the methodology of environmental water flows, which has advanced so far that we can, based on the services and functions played by fresh water for wetlands and aquatic ecosystems and forests and grasslands, to operate in a resilient way, defining the minimum amount of water that needs to remain in the rivers. Now, that number is relevant immediately for countries, businesses, cities, farmers. It can be used directly to define the quantitative share of the planetary scale boundary at the local level. For carbon, we've already gone through that. That's quite simple. I mean, to translate the global carbon budget into an equitable sharing for different economies, for different nations, for different businesses. So that is, I think, the way forward in terms of responding to your question, how to connect the scales. The key is to dare to be quantitative. And we've never been that before. You know, to say, in the Anthropocene, thriving within a safe operating space translates to absolute budgets. In the past, we've always seen it as a relative budget. You know, let's try to minimize environmental impacts as far as we ever can and hope for the best. That's been our paradigm, as if we had more than one planet to exploit. The planet-bound approach does not allow for that. It forces us to think in absolute budgets. And therefore, it forces us to think in numbers. And therefore, it forces us to share a big number to become small numbers among all citizens on Earth. So that's the very hard part of the planet boundary work. Okay, we're coming closer to the end here, but I'd like to take also a question by Sophia Brünze, who asked the following: where are the biggest informational gaps when it comes to changing people's behaviors and/or attitudes? Which are information bottlenecks that could be worked upon? Well, this is, the science of behavioral change is, I think, one of the major investments we have to make forward. What is it that could tip our values, ethics, behaviors, our consumption patterns towards deep transition, towards a deep transition to prosperity within a safe operating space? And I would argue, to start with, that we don't understand those processes well enough. We certainly don't understand them in terms of the speed by which things have to change. Can we have this occurring in a voluntary way? Can it be done through better awareness, knowledge, social networks, agency? Or is it in fact so that the only way to have rapid behavioral change is, as we did with smoking, when the science becomes so overwhelmingly clear, governments go in with strong regulations. And as you know, some of those regulations have been implemented very recently. I mean, remember that the United Kingdom is just a few years back that regulations were forbidding smoking in public environments. And people stepped out and said this was the end of the United Kingdom's pub culture, because pubs would collapse. And today, nobody, people wonder how on earth we could become so upset by the idea of not being allowed to smoke in a British pub, because the pubs have simply become even more attractive environments for social exchange. So it's quite interesting how we can actually have rapid behavioral change through regulatory measures, which, when they are imposed, appear to even violate our own integrity and freedom. But once they're imposed and we come out, with even a higher life quality, we're almost astonished at ourselves that we could actually have values so recently which were violating some of those principles that we now suddenly endorse in full. So I'm quite enthusiastic of the idea of what surprises could we foresee when it comes to behavioral change in terms of our relationship between humans and the biosphere or nature or the planet. But we don't understand the mechanisms very well. And to be honest, that I think is clear. We understand some of the slow variables, but we don't understand how to get big changes to occur at a very, very, at a very rapid pace and at scale. Because remember that the predominant perceptions today, if you go to rapidly growing cities and economies in China or in India, is that consumerism is the dominant paradigm towards what we define as prosperity. That's the dominant value chain. It's not a surprising one. It's something that we, I think, even need to respect. But we also need to understand, therefore, the complexity of how do we transition into sustainable behavioral patterns. Dear friends, is that we could perhaps take one more quick question, which is from Sila Özkavak, which I think is a good closing one. What kind of governance structures would be suitable if we place the bottom-up action at the heart of this discussion? Well, I'm glad about this question, because I should say, not surprisingly, as you all know, that the planetary boundary science, planetary boundary dialogues generally become misunderstood as being, the top-down expert thinking, that we somehow want to impose on the world some kind of expert-based rule from the planetary level, when in fact it is the reverse. I would argue that the strongest argument for conducive, successful bottom-up action is that there is strong leadership also from above. I'm, for example, of the personal opinion that a lot of the depressions among young people which relates to climate risks is in large parts because of lack of political leadership at the global level. If there had been a strong political leadership, I think young people would have felt much more confident that their action when they wake up in the morning and do something good by taking the bicycle to school or to their jobs would be felt as something much more, dynamic and positive, knowing that there is political leadership occurring across the world. So I think there's something quite exciting about linking the bottom up with the top down. How do we then induce more bottom up action? Well, I think it's really about the political leadership we choose at the local scale, spreading awareness about planetary boundary thinking, the Anthropocene, resilience, tipping points, but also the evidence that sustainability is actually a healthier, more democratic, economically interesting and viable option. To create a buzz around sustainability as the cool, high-tech, modern, attractive pathway forward at the local scale. I think we need to abandon in part the kind of die-hard environmentalism we've been so used to in the past. It plays an important role, but if we want to get the masses on board and the real action from bottom up, we need to make sustainability the mainstream, interesting, modern agenda. That has to be the new narrative. But then my closing thinking on bottom up action is unconventional alliances. I think we need to work much more together between science, civil society, local entrepreneurs, young people, musicians, poets, getting a much more uncommon alliance of different actors working together towards telling the story in a both factual, scientific base, but also in an emotional, attractive way. And I always get astonished at, how effective young people are in communicating on social media as compared to, for example, we old scientists are. So this is something that I think we need to work much more together, to be honest. That's why this course is so incredibly exciting, because you represent so many walks of life, and that is, I think, the future. I think that honestly really is the future of getting the connectivity between people having different experiences from different cultures of different ages working together towards the new narrative of the opportunities and the transition towards a future within a safe operating space. We need to close now, unfortunately. I really want to thank you for participating. Thanks for all your great questions. There are so many questions left, but be reassured. Many of these questions we will be able to address along the course. I really now want to flag that you'll have a bonus hangout next week with Professor Will Steffen of Australian National University, one of the fathers behind the entire Anthropocene concept, my closest co-author in the planetary boundary science, the lead author of the update of the planetary boundary work. Nobody is sitting more centrally on these issues than Will Steffen. We were supposed to do this hangout today together, but he couldn't make it. So in fact, you get a double time. So he will run the next one in full on his own. And he's an absolutely wonderful scientist and a wonderful human being. So please do not miss it if you can join that time. It will be a really exciting hangout. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for all your questions again. And good luck with the continuation of the course. And you can't imagine how excited we are here at the Resilience Center, the entire team, in this engagement with you all. With that, we close for today. Thank you very much, and goodbye.